Good afternoon. Welcome to Delta College Forensic Team Debate. We are going to be giving you a parliamentary debate today, and parliamentary is not new, but it is a new format for state and national debate tournaments. Parliamentary debate is an impromptu debate in which the teams receive their resolutions 15 minutes before they are to speak. During that 15 minutes, they prepare a case with only the use of a dictionary. This teams then formulate their cases without referring to any other materials. This requires that they keep abreast of all the major issues that are critical to debate. So this activity promotes critical thinking and informs students. They must think and organize quickly. Today, we will be debating the question, this House believes that the United States should not be policemen to the United Nations. Lindsay Ford and Leslie Zachary will be the opposition. Eric Dean and Jared Burke will be the government. We will have an abbreviated debate today. Instead of the regular 8-minute speeches and 5-minute rebuttals, we will have a 4-minute constructive speeches and 3-minute rebuttals. Thank you.
All right, I'd like to say good afternoon to the Parliament, to the Speaker of the House. I'd like to thank my partner for being here, and of course the opposition. Now, the resolution which we are debating today states that this House believes that the U.S. should not act as policemen for the UN. Now, before we give you our reasons why we believe wholeheartedly in this resolution, we'd first like to offer a few definitions in order to better aid in the progression of this debate. This House is defined as the United States. U.S. in this resolution is, of course, the United States. Should means ought to act as policemen. For means serve as a primary enforcer for, while the UN simply means the United Nations. Now, we see this resolution as a resolution of value. Thus, the value that we as a government will be presenting to you today is that of equality. Now, our value criteria is that if we could prove to you that the United States acting as policemen for the United Nations greatly inhibits equality, then we have proven this resolution to be true and thus have won this debate. Now, in order to prove this, we offer you two main points, and that is economically and ethically. This House believes that the United States should not act as policemen for the United Nations. Now, our first point is, again, economically. Now, what we could see is in cases such as the Persian Gulf War, or even in Kosovo, we see that the vast majority of military equipment, such as warplanes and the like, comes from the United States. Just up until a week ago, we have already dropped 9,000 bombs on the issue of Kosovo. Now, when we look at this, we could see how this is incredibly unproportional. When we look at all the other nations in the United Nations, we can see how the United States, economically, is the nation that is suffering the most. Now, this is not fair and this is not equal, and this is why the United States should not act as policemen for the United Nations, because we are spending so much money compared to all the other nations in the United Nations. Now, this brings us to our second major point. With that, I'll take your first point of information.
If the United States spends so much more money than these other nations, how come the United States has not paid its United Nations debts in the last, I believe it's 5 years, while the rest of the nations have?
How come the United States has not paid its debts?
The United States owes debts, foreign debts, aids to the United Nations. It has not paid, yet those members of the United Nations, such as England and France, have paid. If we pay more, then how come this occurs?
Well, if we're paying more, that may be one of the reasons why we're not paying our debts, because we're spending so much money on bombs and planes and such. I'm not really quite sure I understand the question. If other nations are paying debts, that's good. That's fine. They need to pay the debts, and so should we. However, we are going far beyond paying debts when we are acting as a policeman for the United Nations. We are representing the United Nations economically, and we are spending so much more of our money than I believe all the other nations combined. And this is not equal, and this is wrong. Moving on to our second point, and that is ethically. Now, under the statement of ethically, we should not act as policemen for the United Nations, we're going to present to you two main points, and that is that U.S. forces are soldiers, and secondly, retaliation. Now, first of all, let's look at U.S. soldiers. Let's look at the issue of the Persian Gulf War, just for an example. How come it was so many of our United States soldiers that have suffered dramatically, and how come there are still United States soldiers that are suffering from biochemical weaponry and such used during the Persian Gulf War? Now, additionally, we could see how in Kosovo now we have 3 U.S. POWs in Kosovo. Now, we are suffering, our own forces are suffering, when comparatively it seems that other nations are not suffering nearly as much as far as their forces. We are the ones suffering the losses overall. It is unproportional. And secondly, if you didn't buy out this argument, let's look at retaliation. Let's look at the Persian Gulf War. Now, I'm sure we've heard Saddam Hussein many times call the United States a nation of pigs and such. We've had many insults thrown at us. But the fact of the matter was, it was supposedly the United Nations that was fighting Iraq during the Persian Gulf War. It was supposedly the United Nations. However, why was it that it was not the United Nations that was seen as the enemy, but the United States? Thus, we can see how this is still going on. If Iraq were to retaliate with all the horribly frightening biochemical weaponry and such that we believe that they have, who are they going to retaliate against? Are they going to retaliate against France and Australia and all of the other countries that are in the United Nations? Or are they going to retaliate against their enemy, the United States? They're going to retaliate against the United States because it is the United States that they see as their enemy, not the United Nations, because the United States acts as policemen for the United Nations. And we could see how this is still the case with, again, with the issue of Kosovo and the like. Because what happened just recently, we accidentally, now this is almost embarrassing, the United States accidentally bombed something, but it accidentally bombed the Chinese embassy. So what happens now? Do the Chinese individuals want to retaliate against the United Nations or the United States? It seems they want to retaliate against the United States. And this is why in China, the United States embassy is getting bottles and such thrown at it and is trying to get broken into by Chinese citizens, because we acted as policemen for the United Nations. This is why we see that United States embassies are being assaulted all over the world, because we are attacking and we are serving as a primary enforcer for the United Nations. And this is not equal, and thus we, as the United States, are going to be retaliated against all over the world. And we can see how this has definitely been happening. We can see how this is not equal, and we can see how this definitely threatens and inhibits our own equality when we are the ones being retaliated against. So let's recap. Our value is that of equality. We want equality in the United Nations. We want to be represented equally. We do not want to serve as a primary enforcer for this. And this is our criteria. If we prove that it inhibits equality, then we have proven this resolution to be true. We've shown you how economically the United States is suffering far more than any other nation in the United Nations, the Persian Gulf War and in Kosovo and such. And we could look at how ethically we have POWs. Ethically, we are sending more of our troops than it seems than other nations in many instances. And finally, retaliation. How the U.S. embassies are getting retaliated against, how we have a huge threat over our heads, because if we serve as a primary enforcer for the United Nations, it seems that we are the ones that are going to get attacked if any of these nations, such as Iraq with their biochemical weaponry, wants to retaliate. So for all these reasons, this House should believe that the United States should not act as policemen for the United Nations.
We will now hear from the Leader of Opposition with a speech of no more than 4 minutes.
Thank you. On behalf of the opposition, I'd of course like to thank everyone for being here today, but I'm going to get right into this case because as the opposition, we do not agree with the resolution that the U.S. should not act as a policeman for the United Nations. Now, happily, we do not have a definitional debate here. The definitions are fully accepted for the purpose of today's debate, but we do have a slight problem with the value. We feel that while equality is a value that is a worthy one, there is a primary value for the purpose of today's debate, and that value is justice. If justice is not achieved, equality cannot occur. We've seen this time and again through history. Without justice, one does not have equality. So therefore, we feel that justice needs to be the paramount value in today's debate. So the criteria we are going to have is we can show you that justice is inhibited by the United States not acting as a policeman. Therefore, if the United States were not to act as a policeman, justice would be inhibited for the purpose of today's debate, we win. Now first, I'm going to go into their case. I'm going to hit their case, and I'm going to show you, one, how their case, one, doesn't even tie into their own value, and two, as if we flow it through our value, shows how justice is inhibited. So first, let's take a look at it by flowing it through their value. First, they discuss economically, and they gave the example of the Persian Gulf War, and how, let's say, most of the troops in the United Nations are, of course, United States troops, that most of the technology and such comes from there. And they say that by not acting as the primary enforcer, then, of course, economically we'd be equal. But one, they showed no justification for this. They never showed how by moving out this does not occur. Our troops are still in the United Nations. All the stuff, all the ideals that we've committed are committed and will be committed to the United Nations. It's part of our deal with the United Nations. We provide these troops and we provide these such instances. They say we suffer the most economically. That's why we have in debts and we've incurred these debts. Yet we don't suffer the most economically, because we need to look at the fact that the United States, one, just received a surplus that it puts towards its military. Secondly, we refuse to pay our debts to the United Nations because we feel we want to aid other countries. And as such, our economic status is not the same as theirs. We don't have equality because we put too much in. We don't have the equality because we choose not to give the money to them. Secondly, ethically. Well, this is an important consideration when we're looking at the issue of equality. First, we need to take a look at U.S. forces. They say U.S. forces are the ones who suffer the retaliation and such as that. But when the U.S. forces suffer not because of the fact that they're a majority of NATO, but because we are the United States and we represent the United States as a whole. Because of this, whether or not we became a primary enforcer or a secondary enforcer, we would still be seen as the enemy of these nations, such as the Persian Gulf. Time and again, terrorists and such have stated that the United States is the enemy, no matter what their actions. Just because we are not the primary enforcer does not mean we will not suffer the same inequalities. Secondly, Kosovo. As sad as this may sound, the issues of Kosovo deal with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, not the United Nations. So issues and incidents that occur because of this do not deal with this debate at all for the purpose of today. Because of this, we must ignore the Kosovo's issues. But now let's take a look at this if we flow this through justice. We begin to realize that if we are not the primary enforcer, economically and ethically are important considerations, but the issue of justice is not served. Time and again, we've seen justice achieved in the United Nations primarily because of U.S. presence and U.S. presence only. Without this U.S. presence as the primary enforcer, justice is not achieved. And we're going to see this through the 3 points I'd like to offer now. I'll take this point of information.
Were we or were we not in the Persian Gulf War seen as the main enemy of Iraq? Did Saddam Hussein see us or not see us as the main evil in his cause?
Well, I can't say what Saddam Hussein thought or what Saddam Hussein didn't think. All I know is that he considered all an enemy, because if he didn't consider everyone an enemy, we wouldn't have had Turkish soldiers, English soldiers, and French soldiers dying alongside American soldiers. But now let's get into our points. First, let's take a look at the military. We need to take a look at the military through the issue of justice. The reason the United States has the primary number of troops and tools is because they are the primary enforcement, and they have the best in the world. We are the superpower as far as military. We have the highest technology, the best trained troops. As such, we commit these troops in the interest of justice. Without these troops, justice is not achieved. We have seen this time and again through history that without the presence of American troops, such as in World War I, justice was not achieved. Second, U.S. interest. U.S. needs to be a primary enforcer for the United Nations because as such, as one of the members of the Security Council within the United Nations, our interests are intertwined within those interests of the United Nations. Without our presence there, our interests suffer and abroad, but at the same time, U.S. interests as far as justice suffer. The United Nations stands for justice in the world. That's its presence. That's what it's there for. That's what it's necessary for. And without the United Nations, the U.S. acting as a primary enforcer, making sure that UN follows its policies and participates in them, justice is suffered. Finally, we need to look at mistakes. The fact that mistakes do occur. As noble as our ideals may be and as we may be, mistakes occur. And with the presence of the United States as a primary enforcer for the United Nations, not just sending their troops, but primary enforcer as far as laws are concerned and making sure United Nations abide by its laws, justice is achieved because United Nations achieves the justice it set forth to establish when it was established. So reviewing the 4 points, first, economically and ethically, really don't meet the value of equality that the government established upon themselves, and how they never showed that by not being the primary enforcer, equality is achieved. Secondly, how their value does not meet the primary value of justice. But thirdly, if we take a look at the opposition case, we can see through the points we've offered that justice is achieved, and therefore we urge an oppositional ballot.
government with a speech of no more than 4 minutes.
Okay, thank you, and thanks Speaker of the House, my partner, again for help setting up a great case and our worthy opposition. Now to begin, I just got to start with their whole value of justice. Let's take a look at the value of justice, saying without justice we can't have equality. Whose justice are we talking about? This is an ethnocentric view. It is a totally ethnocentric view. They're saying whose justice are we talking about? We're going to force our justice upon other countries of the world, and yes, and that is what they intend to do. So again, their value of justice does not stand in this debate at all. There will be a weighing factor. It is not a value. Is not a weighing mechanism against our value of equality. So first we must have equality, and then we can go for justice, and then we can go for non-ethnocentric views. So again, they accept our definition, so this is great. This is going to help a lot. So let's move on first to our first point then, which is economically. And now my partner brought forth the vast majority of the military equipment used in Kosovo, Saudi Arabia, even Bosnia has been U.S. equipment, and we brought forth the point that 9,000 bombs have been dropped as of last week in Kosovo, more than 9,000 now. Who's paying this bill? Who's covering this bill? The United States. They want to say the United States does not suffer as much economically. This is what they're saying. We don't suffer as much, but we continue this way and we will. And they want to bring forth that we owe debts. We owe debts to the UN. Okay, if we're helping all these other countries and being the primary enforcer, who's coughing up the bill again? Who's paying for the bill? The United States is paying for the bill. Again, we are paying for the bill. Okay, so we owe some money, but look what we have done. Let's weigh this. Let's take the benefits here. We could help other countries. We could hold off on paying maybe another debt. What are we going to do? Again, it's ridiculous. So again, let's move next to ethically. U.S. forces, my partner brought forth that U.S. forces are most at risk. And he brought forth the Persian Gulf War. And he brought forth, and again in Kosovo, and how we had the 3 POWs, which is great to have them back with us. But we got to say that we, again, are most affected. We are suffering the most. U.S. suffers the most with this. With that, I will take your point of information.
You state that we suffer the most, yet as terrorists have time and again said, no matter what U.S. presence is, U.S. will be seen as the enemy no matter what. How does not being a police officer put these at any less of a risk than they were before?
Okay, and I'm glad you asked that, because now, these terrorists, and this is actually a great point, this is going to help a lot. Terrorists are going to come to the United States because we are as the infidel in Iraq, or we are coming and we are, with our ethnocentric views in Kosovo, coming into a sovereign nation that we shouldn't be in, as it's seen throughout the world, and though our media portrays it differently, but this is what it is. Now let's take a look, with terrorists. Yes, they attack the U.S. Yes, they do, because we are the primary enforcer. We are the ones in every country. We are the ones going in Bosnia, in Kosovo, in Iraq, using our forces to do what is necessary and again to further our views and interests. We see next with retaliation. Who are they going to retaliate against? And that goes again with the terrorists. They're going to retaliate against the United States. They're going to retaliate with us. What happens like with the Chinese embassy? It's sad, but we accidentally bombed the Chinese embassy. How does this happen? I don't know. And it just seems that we have old maps they seem to portray. This is ridiculous. If China, as Russia, threatened to withdraw already, and we can see that they have threatened withdrawal from the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. China, or Russia, with Russia and China against us, what's going to happen? These are two major nations with nuclear warfare, and if they decide that they don't want the U.S. being the primary force, they don't want the U.S. Getting involved, what's going to happen? They're going to retaliate. Who they retaliate against? The United States. And next to the off case that the opposition brought forth, they said, first, the U.S. has the best force in the world. And this threatens our security. This threatens our security. Yeah, we have the best force in the world, but again, we're going to have the terrorist attacks, and they're going to come after us because we have the best forces. U.S. interest in other countries? Yeah, we go down to other countries for U.S. interest, and again, that's ethnocentrism, and that totally that's wrong. And with 3, mistakes do occur. Give me a break. Mistakes occur because of mapping. Come on. If there's going to be retaliation, China's going to retaliate against the United States, as they have in. But this is just a minor thing. This will continue to escalate as long as the U.S. puts forth their ethnocentric beliefs on other countries. And with that, with that, we propose.
Okay. Now we'll hear from the member of the opposition with a speech of no more than 4 minutes.
Thank you, everyone, for being here for this wonderful debate. Our members of Parliament, of course, and of course, my partner who helped me get a third place bronze medal at Milwaukee. But moving on, the resolution today is that this House believes that the United States should not act as policemen for the United Nations. Now, the biggest problem that we have in this case, of course, comes down to the value and how, if their value proves their case, then of course they win. But we feel, as the members of opposition, that it hasn't proved their case, so we have no choice but to vote for an opposition ballot. But let's look at the definitions. We, of course, have agreed with the definitions, but the problem we have is with their value of equality. Now, the biggest problem we have is that they bring up different points about economically and ethically, but it hasn't really shown us how, looking at this, how is having the United States pull out going to lead to equality. And we feel that as a member of the United States and being the primary force that we are going after the right thing, which is justice. And justice is what leads to equality. So if you look at our value of justice, you will see how that will continue to uphold throughout this case. Now, the biggest question that the member of government bring up was talking about whose justice. And we're talking today about the United Nations, the justice set forth by the United Nations. And that's what we're looking at today. We're not necessarily looking about the Chinese embassy, Kosovo, but instead we're looking at the United Nations and how we are the primary enforcer and how important our job is being a part of the United Nations. Now, different points that the member of government bring up is that about the bombs being dropped and about Kosovo. But Kosovo is NATO. And when they're talking about Kosovo today, that is not necessarily having to do with the issue of the United Nations. But not only is that the problem, they talked about 9,000 bombs being dropped and how it's mostly coming from us. But when you really think about it, that's the job of the primary enforcer. And by pulling us out, then the countries, the United Nations, will continue to suffer even more. We as a nation won't suffer because we aren't suffering today. It's other countries that are suffering, and that's what the United States is about. They're a superpower. They step in and help other countries. And by pulling us out, how is that going to lead to equality within these countries that are looking for us to help them with that issue on its own? And at this time, I'll take your first point of information.
Does not NATO have to go to the UN Security Council to get permission for action?
Well, once again, that is true. But when we're looking at the issue of Kosovo, we're looking at that's a separate. We're saying that basically, when it comes to the United Nations, we're looking at two separate issues today. And what we want to focus on is basically what the resolution has set forth. Now, another point that they bring up is that we are suffering the most. The terrorists are going to come because we are the primary enforcer. But is this really true? Why are these terrorists coming? They're coming because we have different views that are maybe going against ours. We have different beliefs, and they don't like them beliefs that they have, so they come and maybe do acts of violence. But once again, but by pulling out, are they saying that the terrorists will stop, that this won't continue? We are already known as being the primary enforcer. By pulling out, is that going to even help us? Are they going to still come? So this is not really a solution by us pulling out at all. They talked about the Chinese embassy, and once again, that was didn't have to do with the United States itself. They keep on putting this on the United States, but the Chinese embassy was bombed by members, by other members. And so when you think of this and you look at different points, you'll see how they haven't really set proof for their value of that of being equality. Now, members of opposition have bring up a few points, and what we have a problem with is there are 2 points of economic and ethically. And my partner got up and talked about different things that they haven't met their value in these 2 points. When they talk about economics and they talk about the Persian and Gulf War in Kosovo, and how it's so unproportional. Basically, when you look at it, it's saying that our ideals are committed to the United States. That's a part of our deal, and that's what we as a country are. And so by pulling us out, then that leads to more problems. We talked about how we're not suffering. The United States is still a superpower. We're helping others pay their debts, and that's our job today. And by doing that, we're leading to a sense of accomplishments in ourselves. When you look at their point, it's the ethical issue and how United States forces or soldiers in the Persian Gulf War, how they're still suffering, the 3 POWs and things like that, and about Saddam Hussein. When you look at it, it's not really because we're the primary force, but because Saddam Hussein saw everybody as a certain point of it being an enemy. And so when you really look at it, it's not just the United States. We can't just necessarily put this on the United States. They talked about how NATO, Chinese embassies in Iraq, and when you really look at their points, it still doesn't lead to how, by having us not be the primary forces within these different things, how basically it's going to lead to equality. And so I just want to end up by saying the United States is a superpower, and we still should continue to stay that way. And of course, as the Milwaukeeans say, oh yeah.
We'll now hear from the Leader of Opposition for rebuttal.
Well, one last time, I'd like to thank everyone on behalf of the opposition, and I'm going to get straight into this and show you why for today we have won as the opposition. First, I'm going to take a look at the value, then I'm going to go on case, and then I'm going to go off case, and I'm going to show you why this occurs. First, let's take a look at the values. The value of equality versus justice is an important consideration here today. They say that justice is not the value we need to look at because it's an ethnocentric view. Whose justice should we be concerned about? But as I stated and my partner stated, we're concerned with the United Nations justice, the reasons the United Nations was established and set forth. And we need to consider this justice needs to be achieved before equality can. And they never argued that the fact that historically justice leads to equality, and without justice we can't have equality. That was never touched upon. So for this we can see that justice is the paramount value for today's debate. But secondly, we need to look at how their case does not even uphold the value or meet the criteria that they established upon themselves. First, economically, they state, well, economically, the United States has debts, we give so much money, all this, and if we weren't the primary enforcer, this wouldn't occur. But they never showed this. They never showed, well, if we weren't the primary enforcer, then the equality would be achieved, that equality would occur because of this. Secondly, ethically, they say U.S. forces and retaliation. Because of that, they state, well, U.S. forces suffer because we're the primary force. They retaliate against the United States because they're the primary enforcer. But we've seen historically, and as both me and my partner have got up and stated, terrorists such as Saddam Hussein, such as Gaddafi, individuals such as these have stated that despite the U.S., they attack the U.S. because of their beliefs and their stances. And both me and my partner stated that the U.S. will be attacked not because they're a primary enforcer, but because of who we are and what we stand for. Because of this, we need to get into the fact that we realize that, secondly, the U.S. is a superpower, and removing this does not change. It never shows that because of this. Now let's take a look at the case that we've offered. We show military U.S. interests and mistakes. We talk about how we, in the military, we need justice because the military, we've seen, achieves justice. U.S. military achieves justice in the United Nations, not vice versa. We need the military to achieve justice, U.S. interests. We need to protect U.S. interests abroad and at home, and we do this by being the peace enforcer. And finally, we need to take a look at mistakes. Mistakes have occurred, but with the U.S. presence there, these mistakes do not continue to occur, and justice is achieved. For these reasons, we urge an oppositional ballot.
Okay, we'll now hear from the Prime Minister for his final rebuttal.
All right, thank you. Well, it's been a great debate so far. Now, what I'd like to do in this 3 minutes that I have is basically crystallize on some of the main points brought up in this debate and show you why we have undeniably proven this resolution to be true. First of all, let's look at the whole conflict between values. They say, oh, you cannot have equality without justice. I beg to differ. It's the other way around. How could you have justice without equality? Equality is a prerequisite to justice, and they seem to confuse this throughout this entire debate. Justice cannot exist unless there is first equality. So we must first focus on equality. Now, secondly, let's look at how not only are all of these things that are happening because the United States is acting as policemen for the UN, not only are they not equal, but they're not just either. Okay, let's look at this. We talked about economically and ethically, and we talked about all this retaliation. Let's compare this here. If the Chinese embassy was bombed by British bombers, it would be UK embassies being attacked by the Chinese, not American. Okay, this is why we could see, because we are acting as a primary enforcer for the United Nations. And again, let me remind you, NATO is related to the United Nations. They must go through the United Nations Security Council, and thus it is still the principle of the thing. It is the United States that is going to get retaliated against. It is the United States that Saddam Hussein saw as their main enemy. And it's not just because we're a superpower, it is because we are the policemen for the United Nations. So what happens is, who is Saddam Hussein going to bomb first? Who is Saddam Hussein going to retaliate against first? It's not going to be Britain or France or Australia. It is going to be the United States. We do not want this. This is not equal, nor is it just. Okay? We need to focus on justice and equality here. It's not equal. We are seen as the infidel, and we cannot have this if we want to have any kind of economic stability or ethical stability within our nation, the nation of the United States. Because as we are acting as a policeman, again, let me remind you, it's not just and it's not fair that we are spending more money than any other nation and that we are going to get retaliated against, and that is we are seen as the main enemy, not as the United Nations. If you were to ask Saddam Hussein, who is your main enemy here? He would not say the United Nations and all these nations within the United Nations. He would say the United States. And this is the main problem. And this is why the United States should not act as the policeman for the United Nations. And this is why we beg to propose this resolution.